a son accused of killing his father. And to the Romans, that was a dreadful crime. It was actually one of the oldest crimes that we know they did deal with in courts. And the punishment unusually was an unusually severe one. If you were found guilty, you would be sewn up in a sack, we are told, with a dog, a snake, a monkey, and a rooster, and tossed out to sea. The idea was that you had, offended against the gods. You were a pollution that could bring destruction on the city. So Cicero has to take on a client who's been accused of this.
This is CBS Eye on the World. I'm John Batchelor. Marcus Tullius Cicero. I welcome Josiah Osgood, whose new book very much tells the story of a lawless republic, the title of the book. This is Rome before the emperors. This is Rome before Caesar's murder. This is 1st century BCE, born 106 BC and enjoying a career until his death in 43 BCE, is Marcus Tullius Cicero. We know much about him because he had a very loyal slave named Tiro, who left a great deal of evidence of Cicero's best moments in trial and his letters afterwards, because he was not only a masterful orator and a great defense attorney, he became a political actor involved in all of the machinations right up until the birth of the empire. Professor Osgood, congratulations. You and I both have exchanged thoughts about this. There's a high entertainment value here. At the same time, there's serious business about the end of a republic and the beginning of an empire, always a moment here in the United States, because there's reason to believe we've built our institutions on the foundations laid down by the Romans more than 2,000 years ago. First, Marcus Tullius Cicero. As a young man, he was a new man, that is to say, not born into the elite. What does it mean to be a new man in the 1st century BCE in Rome? Good evening to you.
Yes, thank you, John. It's great to be here. So Cicero, as you said, he was an entertainer. He's laugh out loud funny. I still laugh reading him. My students, new to Cicero, they laugh as well. Uh, so he's always good entertainment value. But he was a new man, as you say, and that meant something particular in Rome. The Republic was based on elections. You had to win your spot to be in politics. But in reality, uh, a relatively small group of families controlled especially the highest positions. And Cicero is a new man. He did not belong to any of those families. He came from a little town south of Rome, about 60 miles uh, down the road, and really had no name recognition. Uh, so he ended up rising to the top, and he was very proud of this. He actually got elected to every office the earliest year legally possible, according to the rules. And nobody did this. Nobody had done this for a generation. So it's really a sign of his great success as a lawyer, that he built a name for himself and managed to persuade the power brokers, voters to back him.
The courts, I learned from you that they were not inherited from the misty distances. They were built in the 2nd century BCE in order to stop the corruption. And there were many courts, different kinds of courts over the years, all of which we put together into a criminal court, felony court. What attracted Cicero to oration in the Roman Forum? Why did he choose to be a lawyer?
Yes, so the criminal courts of Cicero's day, they were held in the Forum, and this is sort of the big open square at the heart of the city. And the idea was this would allow, of course, publicity, right? Traditionally, as you say, the courts were a late development in Rome. And traditionally, if you put somebody on trial, uh, the person would go before the whole assembly of the people. And the citizens of Rome decided to sort of delegate their power to convict to jurors. And these were very high-ranking men, often only senators, in fact. But the idea of having the trials in the forum was still that you could draw a crowd and that the people would get to see justice, right? These criminal courts, they didn't cover everything we would call a crime today. So theft, for example, even in fact, certain types of murder may not have been covered in the criminal courts. There was a particular focus on netting politicians, right? People who had really were perceived as having gone against the public interest.
There was a murder one night in Rome. A man named Roscius is dead. Prominently, he owns lots of farms that are being supervised by his son. The son is accused of the murder. Cicero takes the case. Nobody's ever seen this man before. Who is he? 30 years old. He proceeds to demonstrate that what we understand as courtroom acceptable language was work in progress early on. The storytelling mattered a great deal. What surprised me, Josiah, was to learn that much of this looks like Perry Mason with Trask attached to it. You remember when Perry used to pick up a phone and say, would you look into, and then he would come back with all kinds of private detective information. Cicero was his own private detective. Was he taught that, or was that his invention to put facts behind his rhetoric?
Yeah, so that's a wonderful comparison. And Cicero, these trials, I think they would have had all the thrill of Perry Mason or Law and Order or whatever your favorite criminal justice show is on TV. So uh, the big thing about the courts to keep in mind is there was no public prosecutor. So that's a key difference between our system and the Romans. So, and there was no police force really either. So the lawyers had to do all their own investigating. And if you determined, somebody had committed a crime or you thought somebody did, you would apply to prosecute. Now, Cicero normally stayed on the defense side, and that's really how he earned favors to call in. But whichever side you were on, of course, nowadays defense lawyers need to investigate to defend their clients. But Cicero was good at that. It's sort of figuring out, what might the prosecution say and how am I going to rebut it? Um, so that's a little bit about kind of the why these lawyers feel like sleuths at the same time. And that's part of what makes Cicero fun. So the first trial that you mentioned, this is his debut in the criminal courts, and it's a murder trial, and it's a particular class of murder. It's parricide, a son accused of killing his father. And to the Romans, that was a dreadful crime. It was actually one of the oldest crimes that we know they did deal with in courts. And the punishment unusually was an unusually severe one. If you were found guilty, you would be sewn up in a sack, we are told, with a dog, a snake, a monkey, and a rooster, and tossed out to sea. The idea was that you had, offended against the gods. You were a pollution that could bring destruction on the city. So Cicero has to take on a client who's been accused of this, who's been accused of parricide. This is Roscius, and as you said, John, his father, right, was a wealthy landowner. He was stabbed in the dark streets of Rome one night, and a couple of his relatives are the ones who launched the prosecution. And Cicero has to get up there and get this guy off the hook. So it was high stakes, which suited Cicero because he wants to make a name for himself. But he had a tough job there, right? With the sort of stigma of the accusation of murdering your father.
What I like about Cicero at this point is that he figured out what Hollywood knows, follow the money. It's wonderful, Josiah, to see that it doesn't turn around to be Oedipal. It turns out to be a bank account. The allegation is directed against the son because the presumption is that he would inherit. Not so. Cicero discovers that there's a team that have taken advantage of the moment the man's death and taken his property for a very low sum. It was fantastically assessed over millions of it, of assessed millions of this. All of a sudden, I
Sesterces, yeah.
and instead they took it. They bought it very cheap. But what's surprising about Cicero at this point is he knows to tell a story, not to worry about that if you don't have witnesses and evidence. Tell a story. And that was acceptable to the courts, correct? You didn't have to prove what you were saying, just tell a good story.
That's right. Well, because as we said, there weren't police, right? There's no forensic science, really. Fingerprints are the things we would think about in the modern world. So, you might have witnesses, and in some cases they were very important. But often these trials would come down to sort of one side's story against the other. And what is the character of the individuals involved, for example, and what motive did they have? So it can sort of feel like Agatha Christie mysteries, who has the motive, who has the opportunity? You sort of debate these things. And um, part of Cicero's defense was exactly as you say, follow the money. To give you a Latin phrase, he says, cui bono, which means who stood to gain. And this phrase, of course, survives sometimes in modern law discussions, right? But it goes back to the Romans. And uh, Roscius inherited his father's estate. So, of course, the prosecution um, would talk about that. But Cicero, I think, pretty much proved that there was sort of a frame up against him to get the estate. And then when he started to cause problems, they wanted to frame him for murder.
And yet the Republic turned on money. And a man named Varus, Gaius Varus, became governor of Sicily, which was the breadbasket of Rome before they acquired Egypt, in 73 BCE, and stole everything he could get his hands on that he regarded as art, everything. Although you could say he borrowed it and didn't return it. By the time Cicero came to this story, the people of Sicily had had enough and moved a case against him in the Roman Forum. The amazing thing to me, Professor, is that Cicero took it on because Verus is extremely well connected, not only to all the members of the Senate in Rome, but to Metellus, who becomes the governor after Verus. I want to say, what was Cicero thinking? Where did he think he could go with this? Because he's taking on billionaires.
Yeah, so normally Cicero defended those accused. And of course, that was a good way still to win fame, but also earn favors. And one thing that's sort of interesting about the Roman Republic is prosecution could be regarded as a little bit dirtier almost, right? Sort of going after people. It was sometimes said prosecutors were vicious individuals. So Cicero had been careful to avoid that, but as he's rising up the ladder, he suddenly decides he's going to take the case. Now, one reason was Cicero had actually spent a bit of time on the beautiful island of Sicily. He'd been in government service there, a pretty lowly post, but he'd made some friends on the island. The other reason he really took the case was the tides in politics were shifting at that moment, and there were sort of powerful individuals calling, at least sort of symbolically, for a cleanup of Roman government. There'd been a lot of scandals, and there's in particular a guy named Pompey, who's a major politician, and he had connections on Sicily too. So I think Cicero kind of has the backing of one group that wants to sort of target this problem of corruption, and Varys is sort of going to be the scapegoat.
So Pompey is behind Cicero taking on Varus, and behind Varus is the Senate, or the Senate as influenced by Sulla. The other major figure here is Sulla the dictator, who I believe has retired at this point, but Cicero had to be very careful. Is Varus backed by Sulla?
Yeah, so Sulla had died at this point, but you're right that Varys was an old follower of this general Sulla and had fought for him in a civil war. That's how he really started to rise up the ladder himself. And part of what's interesting about Cicero is he is born in this period where young men, many of them did choose sides in civil war, and they did some pretty awful things in their careers. And Cicero managed to escape that himself. And I think that's part of the sort of dynamic in this trial is Varys is very much sort of part of kind of what Cicero would call a crooked establishment. And Cicero is the outsider who's going to come in and try to expose them. And here at this point, he claims, I'm fighting on behalf of the Roman people, stamping out this corruption at the highest levels.
It's 70 BCE now, August. It's hot. And Cicero is going to take the field against a man named Varus, Gaius Varus, who is a notable in that he doesn't hide his thievery. He has a thing, he says, for art, statuary, tapestries, anything that moves, essentially anything that's Greek. Because this is Syracuse, which was a Greek island in the battlefront with Carthage several hundred years before, but right now we're dealing with the Greek island stripped of all of its artwork by Gaius Varus. And the new governor, Metellus, comes in and sort of covers up for Varus because they're all in this together. This is the Senate, and the courts only care about the Senate. Ordinary people walking around in the streets, let them take care of themselves. Let them settle their own disputes. This is 2,000 years ago. Cicero's taken up the cause, however, of some of the Sicilian citizens, especially those around a village named Etna, who are offended by having everything stolen from them. And they bring a case against Gaius Varus. But there's one part of the case that is emphasized by Cicero, who follows the rules of the Senate. There's timing, the courts, there's timing about how long you have to produce your trial, to produce witnesses, to finish your testimony. He tells the story of a pirate raid on Syracuse, the famous Greek city, where Plato probably conceived the Republic. And the Romans know all this. In fact, Cicero has made himself a student of the academy in Athens at one point in his career, and he studies rhetoric and oratory and how to train your voice. The Greeks very much influence all the decisions of a young man like Cicero. And we come to the pirate raid, and he tells the story to bring tears to the eyes of not only the audience but the jury about how Varus, locked in the island just off the coast of Syracuse, did nothing to help the people of Syracuse when they were raided by the pirates. He cavorted with women. There's a suggestion that they're fallen women. He drank excessively and did not come to the aid of the Roman citizens left to be plundered by the pirates. Josiah, I tell that story because none of this is admissible in our understanding of a court, but it's just the beginning of Cicero's magic to come up with a scenario that he doesn't have to prove, but everybody goes along with it, as if he's an HBO movie suddenly appearing in the middle of the forum.
I think that's exactly right. So the Varys had been a governor. He was supposed to be in charge of Sicily, running this, as you say, this breadbasket. It's an important place for Rome. And a lot of his crime is embezzlement. And Cicero's fear was that jurors would just glaze over, hearing this amount of money, that amount of money, etc. So he wants to create a memorable image of Verres. And you've got it exactly right. He talks about how Verres, instead of attending to official business, defending the province, he was partying, like a rock star the entire time he was there, according to Cicero. He erected put up special tents along the seashore where he could have all-night parties, and he would, summon the wives of the leading magistrates, local magistrates of the island, and he would drink with them. Cicero said that Verres brought along his young son to the parties. That was another scandalous thing he did. So of course this just sticks in your mind, and Cicero wanted the jurors to have this picture, and the audience listening to the trial to have this picture that Verres, instead of, you know, helping the Roman people, doing his job, he was just living large off everyone else.
And the storytelling wins the jury. We presume that Varus was defeated when he fled, and that was proof enough. Oddly, however, having stolen millions of sesterces worth of art and embezzled everybody and allowed the town to be plundered, the worst that can happen to a Roman citizen is that he spends the rest of his life in Marseille. Why was that a punishment? Because was Rome that magnetic?
Yeah, so this is a shocking thing to us. You could be found guilty. Verres defaulted actually mid-trial. He left Rome, so he admitted his guilt. It was clear. But the normal punishment, there was this exception if you murdered your father, as we discussed, but the normal punishment was you would just be sent off into exile. So you would lose your citizenship. You could never participate in politics again. And the Romans did consider that a sort of terrible fate. But that was it. So Verres, right, as this great art collector, probably managed to take most of this wonderful statuary he'd robbed the Sicilians of off to the French Riviera, where he spent the rest of his life. Not exactly a dreadful punishment as far as I'm concerned.
Yes, nothing compared to being thrown in a sack into the sea with a rooster. I mean, that sounds cruel. Going to Marseille doesn't sound so bad. All right, that establishes that Cicero takes on the rich and the powerful as long as he has a backer. He continues to climb politically, however, and his ambition is to be consul. And he comes to the vote where he's up against rivals to be consul, and everybody votes in the field of Mars. It's all very ceremonial. Note that we follow much the same tradition today. The vote is very important to all citizens. People are urged to participate. There are questions about true to the vote. Everything 2,000 years later, exactly the same. We come to the scene that's behind me right now, if you're watching this on a video, and I will describe it. It is the Temple of Jupiter, Pompey's Theater, in Rome, and Cicero is declaiming to the gathered senators who are arranged in sweeping rows, not unlike the U.S. Congress, banks of seats that are in a semicircle around the center. There's one man off to the left or right, depending on how you look at the picture, and he's sunk in despair. That is Catiline, a senator, a brave man, an experienced soldier, very powerful. And this is the moment of the Catiline conspiracy. And we have much of it, all of it from Cicero's point of view, but we have it thanks to him. Professor, I leave you to tell the backstory about why these two are such rivals and why Cicero feels moved to denounce his fellow senator. Cicero's consul, he's very powerful at this point. Catiline is a senator. He's not unpowerful, but he's courtly. He's an aristocrat. He's the elite. He's famous. And Cicero is none of these things except for he's clawed his way into the consulship. So Why would Cicero take on Catiline? How does he gain from this? Who benefits, Professor?
Yes, so this really is the climax of Cicero's career as far as he's concerned. And he feels this is his moment. Really, yes, he's successfully prosecuted Varys, he's had other victories, but this is really his moment to make a mark on history, to enter the history books. So Catiline actually ran against Cicero when Cicero was running for the consulship, and they were complete opposites, as you said, right? Cicero is the new man, fresh on the scene in Rome. Catiline came from an ancient family, and Catiline lost to Cicero and really was humiliated by this. You know, the newcomer has prevailed over him. And of course, Cicero equally was thrilled. You know, this proved what a hotshot he was. So what happened was Catiline decided the next year, when Cicero was in office now, in the top office, Catiline decided he was going to run again. And really because financially he was growing desperate, Catiline sort of started to put on the mantle of reform. There's a lot of popular unrest at the moment in Sicily. In Italy. There seems to have been a problem with the credit system. Loans are being called in, a lot of suffering. And Cicero is more in league now with the financial group in Rome. Catiline, even though he hadn't really been a populist earlier, he decides to go more in that direction now. And Cicero feels he has to stop Catiline, prevent him from being elected again, and quash any of Catiline's plans to cancel debts, for example. So that kind of sets up the final showdown between the two, and Catiline loses in the subsequent race for the consulship. And at that point, he's a very desperate man.
And puts together a group of young men, very fashionable. These are the hippest people in Rome. And they gather around him. They shave their beards in a certain way. Who knows fashion? And Cicero learns about it because he's got spies everywhere. Cicero's a new man, but he's also paranoid, wisely so, given, and you can see in the scene here, everybody sitting back listening to him has what I fancy a dagger point somewhere under their toga. These are the senators, these are the elite. And Catiline gathers together an army and is defeated and dies in battle. But that's not the end of the story because Cicero, having been the hero, bringing forward the Catiline conspiracy and saving the Republic by identifying a man who was really following the road that Sulla took and that road that Caesar might take. I enjoy the fact that classicist stories are everything you want in a Hollywood thriller plus. It happened. That's the nature of history. You can't make it up. I spent many years as a novelist. And when you're writing fiction, you have to be believable. When you're writing history, you don't have to. It's a freedom. So we're about to enter into the biggest mistake I think Cicero ever made. There are men who are left in Rome who were in league with Catiline, who promised to bring in allies if Catiline marches on Rome and takes over. They were planning to be reformer dictators. 5 of the men were arrested by Cicero. And Professor, help me understand why Cicero makes this mistake because he's so careful to this point. What is the mistake and why do we think he makes it?
Yeah, well, as you say, Cicero felt vindicated by this point because he'd been warning about Catiline a long time. And Cicero was actually right. You know, Catiline went off and joined this military uprising. And there'd been a lot of doubts. Cicero, the new man, can you trust him? You know, his enemies whispered things. So he feels confident now. And it's exactly like a Greek tragedy, right? He has many good qualities, but he becomes overwhelmed by his own sense of invincibility in this moment, his feeling that He's had such a run of good luck now. He has to play his hand to the end. So what happens is there are these friends of Catiline, high ranking, including senators, left behind in Rome, and they're supposed to prepare the way for what Cicero says would be a coup d'etat. So the stakes are high. And Cicero actually wants these collaborators of Catiline to be executed as traitors, traitors to the Republic. And there is a bit of justification for this. Public enemies, as they were called, of Rome, they were supposed to be punished in a harsh manner, right? The idea for the Romans is it's a deterrent. And Catiline still has his army, right? So the question of deterrence is a real one in the minds of Cicero and other senators. So the Senate decides to endorse this, but it's really Cicero's decision in the end to do it. And he does, right? And what what's problematic, I think, is one, he gloats a lot about it afterwards. And that's really not such a good look, right? It starts to sort of arouse um, political opposition. He becomes kind of for the populist movement, right? He becomes sort of a target. The other problem is Julius Caesar, right? Known to us as the future dictator, right? He's still a rising politician. And he had given a speech suggesting that maybe we should just lock these guys up for life rather than execute them. That was an unusual punishment, but Caesar was on the record for having suggested that. So there was a clear alternative that would have been more prudent, and Cicero did not go along with it. He did not throw any support behind Caesar. So this is why it becomes in the long term a disaster for Cicero politically.
Cicero knew that to execute a Roman citizen without a trial was a taboo. Did he address that to Caesar? Or do we know whether he brought that up to Caesar or Caesar brought it up to him?
Yeah, that's right, because we are in this sort of world about punishments. And remember what we said, often you would just be sent into exile. Um, then if a slave, rebelled, then the punishment would be extremely severe. It would be crucifixion, typically, right? But there is this idea then that you're not supposed to do that sort of thing normally to Roman citizens. Cicero's view was that they were traitors, that they were no longer Roman citizens. They'd surrendered their citizenship with their conspiracy. So they should be treated, like the sort of foulest criminal you can imagine. So that's his thinking. But yeah, the problem is others thought that these guys still were citizens and owed, what we would call due process, right? And Cicero doesn't want to extend that to them.
And there's a very dramatic moment in history when the debate continues. I want to make sure I know who's in this room as the question of execution. We know Caesar's there. Is Pompey present? Is Crassus present?
So Pompey was off, the great general. He was off in the east, kind of becoming the Roman version of Alexander the Great. So he's not around conveniently for him during this crisis. Crassus, who's a very wealthy, very powerful politician, a friend of young Julius Caesar, Crassus probably had been kind of in league with Catiline a little bit, but then saw the writing on the wall and turned on him. But one of Cicero's complaints actually about Crassus, the two did not get along very well, was that Crassus actually very cleverly didn't show up in the Senate the day that they were debating the fate of these conspirators, because he didn't want to have to take a vote one way or the other. And to Cicero, this is just the height of cravenness, right? What a wimp. Here I am defending the Republic, sticking my neck out, and Crassus can't even bother to come and cast a vote in this discussion, in this debate.
Cicero now has taken on a murder trial in order to demonstrate that he was clever, taken on a rich man in order to demonstrate that he was daring, taken on a conspirator in order to demonstrate he was a great patriot. He's about to take on the Claudii. The Claudii family built the Appian Way, and this is not going to go well. Yes, Caesar will be murdered, but we need to begin with a story of the Bona Dea celebration at Caesar's house in Rome and what happened that night when a strange-looking woman showed up at the door, said to be part of the musical entertainment. Publius Clodius Pulcher, born 92 BCE. He is a major player. Also, he's descended from as famous a family as exists, the Claudii, who built the Appian Way, who won battles, have ceremonies raised for them all the time. He's one of the several brothers and sisters. He's married to Fulvia, who's a major force herself, and his sister is Claudio, who will become, as a widow, the richest woman in Rome. This is a neighborhood called the Palatine Hill. They all know each other and they're all rivals. Cicero, however, has built a house on the Palatine Hill. He doesn't belong in the opinion of the elite who live there. However, Clodius doesn't care about Cicero the night he presents himself as a female at the ceremony of the Bona Dea. Professor, what is the Bona Dea? What does it mean to Rome at the time? Why did Claudius do this?
Yes, so the Bona Dea, that's a Latin phrase. It means the good goddess. And she's kind of a mysterious deity because she was worshipped in secret ceremonies. And in fact, only women were supposed to attend these ceremonies. Now, she's an important goddess. You know, the gods and goddesses, they give the Romans empire, they give them success. So they need to be um, tended to lovingly. So the most important political women in Rome would hold this ceremony, and it took place at night, and they would have it in one of the houses belonging to their husbands, but the husbands were gone. So this was at Julius Caesar's house. He wasn't there, but his wife was in charge. And so far as we can tell, what happened was Clodius, who's a young man, he showed up in disguise as a one of the female musicians to provide music for this ceremony. And he sneaks in, and we're told, right, that one of the uh, slaves in the house realizes he's not a woman, and she yells out, and Julius Caesar's mother, who was there too, she gets out the torches, she conducts a search. They find Clodius hiding in one of the bedrooms of the slaves, right? And of course, they realize who it is. So this is a huge scandal, right? Because he potentially has messed up Rome's good relations with the gods. But to add to it, really to make it the perfect scandal, there's an element of sex involved too. The talk of the town is that Clodius wants to have an affair or is having an affair with Caesar's wife, the woman in charge of the ceremony. So, you know, did Clodius show up to have a tryst with her, right? Or is there something even more going on? Is there sort of almost an element of kind of transgression here that, you know, Clodius wants to do something a little bit shocking? Um, so we don't entirely know the answer to that question, but what is very clear is it turns into a major political scandal, sort of the story of the year. as you can expect, with the level of people involved. And Cicero is going to get involved in it himself.
Yes, he doesn't have to, but he gets involved because they're going to prosecute Claudius for sacrilege or whatever the trial used the term of art. Why does Cicero drop into this? What does he think he has an S on his chest and a cape? I don't understand. He's taken on so much and survived. Why this?
Yeah, so it is basically, as far as the Romans are concerned, a type of sacrilege. Now they didn't always necessarily punish in their courts sacrilege. And in fact, what because the idea was the gods could go after you, they had so much power, right? You don't need human justice for that. But unusually, right, this scandal kind of caused such a stir that a law was passed to put Clodius on trial and sort of ex post facto to create a crime that he could be accused of. And of course, he was very offended by this. He claimed he had enemies in the Senate who were going after him, targeting him for things he had done earlier in his career. So Cicero actually didn't necessarily want to get too on board with it, but the enemies of Clodius were sort of his friends. And it kind of turned into a rehashing. It's a little bit complicated, but it turned into a rehashing sort of the Catilinarian conspiracy. Should the oppressed people be in charge of the Republic, or should a group of senators, right, the ones going after Clodius, should they get to call the shots? And Cicero kind of gets dragged in for that reason. Also, he met with Clodius the day, the afternoon that this scandal happened, right? That Clodius broke into the house where the ceremony was going on. So unusually, Cicero will be called as a witness for the prosecution.
Witness for the so Cicero is roped into being uh, evidence against Claudius.
Yeah, because Clodius's story was that I wasn't in Rome at that time.
I see.
So Cicero is there to break that alibi, as it were. And Clodius had a friend saying, "Oh, he was off in the countryside with me enjoying time at one of our villas." And Cicero is there to break the alibi. And he does so, right? It's another example of how he, sort of feels he must stick his neck out um, to do the right thing as he sees it. But it's going to get him into a hell of a lot of trouble
You bet.
because Clodius ends up being acquitted, and Cicero now has made a very dangerous enemy.
Yes, how did he get himself acquitted? He almost went bankrupt paying bribes, which is part of the trial process in the forum. We're talking not about the word corruption, we're talking about ceremony. You're supposed to bribe if you want to get out of it. That's the way the Senate gains by putting you on trial. However, you will recall that Cicero has made a mistake. Everybody knows it. He executed 5 Roman citizens, very important people, without a trial during the Catiline conspiracy. Everybody knows it, including Clodius, who is now near bankrupt, but he's from an extremely wealthy and powerful family. That won't last long. But we're right now with one of the most powerful and rich families on the Palatine Hill, the Claudii. And the upright son becomes corrupted by his romances and has now been condemned by sacrilege trial and cannot hold a political office in the Senate. He can't rise to be a consul, which is what he wants to be. So he goes another route. He becomes one of the 10 tribunes. What does that mean, Professor?
Yeah, so Clodius escaped. He was damaged, but he wasn't actually convicted, probably because of bribes that he had handed out to the right people. So Cicero is in trouble now because Clodius wants revenge. Uh, what Clodius decides to do is, even though he came from a patrician family, he wants to run for what is the plebeian office. This is an old office that the people of Rome had established, and it was integrated into the political system, where you sort of defend popular interests. Patricians weren't supposed to hold it. So Clodius has to go through kind of a game where he ends up uh, winning legal permission to transfer out of his patrician family. And he gets adopted, and Cicero is very snarky about it. Clodius ends up being adopted, uh, technically anyway, by a man who is younger than Clodius himself. Uh, so this gives him the power. He's then elected to the post of tribune, and this gives him the power to pass legislation. And essentially, what was done to him, he now does to Cicero. And he's going to pass a law that essentially convicts anybody who put Roman citizens to death without a trial.
meaning Cicero. And they
And of
can,
course, he doesn't actually mention, I mean, this is why politics is so delicious in Rome, for those who love the drama of it. He doesn't actually mention Cicero by name in the law, but everybody, and most certainly Cicero, knows that he is the target. So, and it's a wonderful political move for Clodius, right? Because he can say, I'm protecting the rights of the Roman people that are guaranteed to them. But it means Cicero has a big target on his back.
and the end of this is that Cicero will be exiled. Uh,
So the law gets passed, and Cicero doesn't even wait. I mean, he actually kind of has to do, right, what Gaius Verres did earlier. Cicero flees Rome. He
and
kind of goes into exile. So it's a terrible moment for him, right? I mean, he's risen to the top. He has had every success, but suddenly he now is suffering this awful fate of exile.
the keen part of this is what happens when he's leaving the city. That house of his on the Palatine Hill. Did they burn it or did they take it apart first? I can't remember.
Yeah, so part of Cicero's rise to the top was he felt I need a house, right, that proclaims my status as a leading figure in the Republic. So he moves on to the Palatine Hill, where the old families lived. And he has this great mansion there. And Clodius kind of dusts off some old Roman history. There was an idea in Rome that if somebody aspired to kingship, right? Because remember, we're in a republic. If somebody is trying to become king, is acting tyrannically, you can go after the person and you should destroy the person's house as a warning, right? And almost kind of as a monument to popular freedom. It would be like toppling a statue of King George III, right, during the American Revolutionary War. So Clodius goes after Cicero's house. He carries out some of the architectural elements in it, but then he destroys quite a bit of it and actually builds on the site a shrine to the goddess freedom. So it's a huge political coup with him, with his people. And of course, it's a great humiliation to Cicero to have his prized mansion torn down and turned into the shrine by this demagogue he hates.
We need to mention Mrs. Cicero because she's one of the secrets to Cicero's success. She's a very extremely wealthy woman who's a sister of one of the Vestal Virgins. Is she abused once the house is torn down? I think she's driven to live with relatives. I don't remember where.
Yeah, so Cicero married well. It's another sign of his success that a woman from a more prominent political family at a pretty young age spotted his talent and she married him. Her name was Terentia, and they have a long marriage. And of course, when Cicero is ruined, right, she kind of is there left in Rome, trying to piece together everything, trying to look out for their two children, trying to help get Cicero restored. And Clodius, right at the same time, he knows that Terentia's a powerful ally. So he tries to go after her a little bit. So there's a lot of intrigue, right, about getting Cicero restored. And Clodius, of course, fights it with every fiber in him.
Fights it right up until his death. We're telling the story of Claudius versus Cicero. Claudius is enormously powerful because he's famous, but he's disgraced by the Bona Dea incident. Cicero, this is when he actually becomes his own character. Isn't this where he grows his beard and tears his clothes and acts like he's been ruined for life? I don't. Is that during the time that he's away from Rome?
Yeah, Rome is a very theatrical society. It's very visual, and Cicero as a lawyer is attuned to this. So one of the things that defendants typically did when they went on trial is they would, if they were men, most of them were, they wouldn't shave. They would wear sort of dingy, old, dark clothing. They would look as if they were basically mourning and, almost at their own funeral in a sense. And this was meant to stir pity. So Cicero, right, on the eve of being driven out of Rome by Clodius, he has to adopt this look and sort of goes around in the streets, in ashes and sackcloth, we would say nowadays, trying to get sympathy. And actually, he even gets, believe it or not, the whole Senate for a period to dress in mourning too, as a kind of protest, a symbolic, a visual protest on his behalf. But none of it works. Clodius has the people behind him, and they pass that law.
Cicero is exiled because he crossed a very powerful man who found a way to condemn him for the mistake that he made by executing 5 Roman citizens without a trial when he was consul. He eventually returns from exile, however. The year is now 56 BCE. This is important because Caesar and Pompey and Crassus until his death against the Parthians have formed a very powerful triumvirate. And Cicero is not ignorant of these matters, but he's been in exile and now he's back, and Caesar's in Gaul. And eventually, from mid 50s until Caesar returns in triumph by crossing the Elbe, you all know this story. We're looking at the Civil War, the predicate for the Civil War in in Rome, in the Roman Republic. However, we're following Cicero, so we have to be very careful about Cicero's part in all this. Professor, you report that there's no evidence ever discovered that Cicero knew about the rising against Caesar. Is that correct?
That's right. So Cicero uh, didn't want to get involved in the Civil War. He did what he could to try to stop it, but he didn't have enough political power really to matter. Um, so half-heartedly, he joined the side of Pompey. So he fought against Julius Caesar. But as everybody knows, Caesar would win the Civil War. So at that point, Caesar lets Cicero go back to Italy. And Cicero kind of needs to put his life back together. It's not a great time for him. Of course, he's been on the losing side. The courts really have ceased to function, so he doesn't have that anymore. He and his wife divorce, probably because they sort of fell apart during the Civil War. Their marriage did. His beloved daughter dies. So a lot of terrible things happen. And he's really not so involved in politics. So meanwhile, this conspiracy is forming, right? Caesar has clawed away so much power for himself that especially younger Roman politicians, right, they cannot abide this. They think he has become a tyrant. Now, one of the leading conspirators, famous from Shakespeare, is Marcus Brutus. Now, what's interesting is Brutus was kind of a protege of Cicero. We have writings from Cicero, especially philosophical works, before the conspiracy, before Caesar's assassination, where it kind of seems like Cicero is egging Brutus on a little bit, reminding Brutus that actually Brutus's ancestor had removed the last king of Rome. And Cicero is kind of dropping hints. Maybe you want to live up to the great family tradition, Brutus, right? Be a true Brutus yourself. So, so Cicero is not involved in the planning, but as I'm sure we'll talk about, he actually was there on the day itself
Well,
when
let's get
the
right to,
assassins drew the daggers.
yeah, let's get right to it. The room is gathered, and whether Caesar was supposed to go to the forum that day or not, he's there. He comes in, and ordinarily, because he's dictator, well, near to, he's gathering the logistics to campaign in the east against the Parthians. He's leaving soon enough. And senators gather around him when he comes in with their petitions and their remarks because he's the most powerful man in Rome. That will be the conspirators gathering close by him. You've all seen pictures painted over the last 2,000 years of this scene. I did not realize at all, I didn't even think to ask until I read the professor's book, that Cicero was in the room. Cicero saw this happening. Do we have his thoughts? Did any of that survive, Josiah?
Yeah, so I mean, it is just, as you say, kind of mind-boggling, right? That Cicero, who hasn't been told in advance this is going to happen, right? He sees this group of maybe a dozen, maybe a couple more, Marcus Brutus, Cassius, a few others, right? They close in around Caesar. They whip out these daggers they've hidden underneath their togas and they hack away at Caesar until he fell and died. So the senators all sort of look on shocked, right? And most of them, pretty much all of them, actually just run away, not sure what is going on, who might be next. And it seems that Cicero is one of those who fled. But we're told something interesting, um, which is that, and this is a story Cicero himself definitely wants circulated, that when Brutus lifts the bloody dagger high, he calls out the name Cicero, right? As if Cicero sort of has spiritually been the kind of godfather of this plot against Caesar, right? Even though he actually wasn't part of it. And Cicero doesn't want that disowned. So he's very happy that Caesar was executed, and he takes credit sort of for helping to encourage Brutus anyway afterwards.
What's strange to me at this point is that having not been involved, he gets involved. He comes, or do they call upon him because they need to? My assumption is that Brutus and the others believed that they would be celebrated as heroes having slain the tyrant, meaning the king, Caesar. It is a surprise to them when they're not. And we go to Mark Antony's funeral speech, which is Cicero knockoff. And did Cicero attend that? Do we know if he heard Mark Antony's speech in the forum?
Yeah, so as you say, the assassins, feel they're reliving the greatest moments of the Roman Republic, right? We get rid of kings. This is what makes you a hero. But there's a fairly swift popular reaction, right, against them, because Caesar had been a friend of the people. And his will is read out. It turns out he's leaving money to the people of Rome. He's giving his estate to them as a public park. So the mood shifts decisively, and this great funeral is held. And Mark Antony, right, is going to give the eulogy. And Shakespeare fully understood how dramatic, right, Roman political life was. He actually ended up writing plays about it. He thought it was such good material. So Antony, at the may not have given actually so lengthy a speech necessarily, but he did something very dramatic. He lifted the blood-spattered toga of Caesar up on a spear for everybody to see, and the crowd went wild at that point. Antony's grandfather was actually one of the best public speakers in Rome and had mentored young Cicero. So part of what happens at this point in Cicero's life is he gets locked into a contest with Antony, right, about the future of the Republic, but even almost about, who's really the best public speaker. It becomes, at least for Cicero, a rivalry on that level, too.
So Cicero recognizes, or at least should recognize, that Antony's genius that day is from the same teacher that Cicero had, which is demonstrate your feelings. Don't just talk about them. Demonstrate the moment. Don't just talk about it. And raising the bloody shirt is what was done in the 19th century. And you go to a speech by Senator Sumner on the floor of the Senate that follows Cicero as well. I was amazed by that, Josiah. Please explain.
Yeah, so Charles Sumner, senator from Massachusetts, great abolitionist, of course, and political reformer in general. Uh, so determined, right, to end slavery and gave powerful speeches about it, right? Sumner studied classical rhetoric closely and was inspired by Cicero, also the Greek orators. And he actually sort of mocks, right, slave owners in ways that Cicero would recognize. Now, Cicero, of course, wouldn't have taken that same position, right? Slavery was entrenched in the Roman world. But Sumner uses Cicero style invective attack, right? And he goes after the Congressman Brooks from South Carolina, right? And this famously results in Brooks's nephew caning Charles Sumner viciously on the floor of the U.S. Senate when he was sitting at his desk. So it's kind of an interesting, a huge moment, obviously in its own right, but interesting to see the uses that Cicero style rhetoric went to later, right? And raises this parallel that, of course, when passions get very heated, right, we descend into political violence sometimes.
Yes, 44 BCE to 1854. That's quite a reach for Cicero, but he's still reaching. He's now in his 60th year, 63rd year, I believe, 62nd, 63rd year.
Mhm.
And he's worn out his welcome anywhere in Rome. So he's trying to find a side in the civil war underway after Caesar's death. Mark Antony is the righteous avenger of the death of Caesar. Brutus and his conspirators believe they are the Republic. They're going to save the Republic by defeating Mark Antony, who is a bully and untrustworthy, which, by the way, is not inaccurate. However, Cicero chooses badly. How does he make up his mind on this, Josiah?
Yeah, so Cicero has good political antennae, actually, I like to say, except when his own sort of personal reputation is on the line. Maybe this is a common problem among all of us, and then we get blinded a little bit. Um, so he wants to actually stay out of kind of politics after the assassination of Caesar, maybe encourage Brutus a little bit, Cassius. But he's planning to leave Italy for a while. Actually, he even considers going to the Olympic Games as a tourist, right? This is a sign of where Cicero's mind was. But then something changes, and it's a bit mysterious. But he's on the ship. He's actually back in Sicily visiting his old friends, and we're told by him a storm blows him back to Italy, and he hears some encouraging news about Brutus, and he decides, this is my moment. I've got to go back and fight for the Republic that I've defended my whole life. And he goes back to Rome and starts, basically trashing Antony in speeches.
Those are the Philippics, right? The famous.
That's right. That's right. And they survive these speeches. There's one of them that Cicero never even gave, but he wrote it up as if he gave it. It's sort of a pamphlet. It's incredibly vicious, but also funny. And part of Cicero's strategy, right, is that he actually ends up befriending a young man named Octavius, who of course will become the Emperor Augustus. And Cicero thinks he might be able to use this young man to destroy Antony. And it ends up backfiring because Augustus, right, actually is the one who used Cicero just long enough to get established. And then he would turn on Cicero because Cicero had said such nasty things about Julius Caesar, who
Who
was
gives the kill order? Is it Antony?
so yeah, so Augustus is the adopted son of Caesar. And
Right.
as you said, he has to be the avenger. Antony is too. So they both go after Cicero, right? And later on, Augustus wants to pretend, oh, this was just Antony. I really liked Cicero. But I think the politics of the moment was that both of them had to go after Cicero, right? Their rallying cry was avenging Caesar. And Cicero, though he hadn't been in the conspiracy, right? He had not said nice things about Caesar.
The legend says that Cicero knew he was going to be killed. The legend said he was down by the seaside and that when the soldiers showed up to kill him, he let them do it by extending his neck. Is that all make believe, Josiah?
Well, you mentioned early in our discussion, right, the name of Tiro, who was Cicero's beloved secretary, had been enslaved. Cicero freed him. He really perpetuated Cicero's memory, published works of Cicero after Cicero died. So probably some of this version of Cicero's death that we get that does make him look heroic, right? Sort of unflinchingly facing this hit squad. That's probably Tiro's version of events. But I think it's not inconceivable. Cicero at that point would have known he was finished. And there, is sort of an increasing fashion in this period, sort of to die heroically when defeated. An enemy of Caesar named Cato had done that. So maybe Cicero realizes this is sort of his final moment, and he wants to play it to the full. And it would be in keeping with his sort of sense of theater.
We have a few moments, and I want to reflect on Cicero in the 21st century. When your students first come across those Ciceronian documents, what we have, what Tiro preserved, sometimes rewrote, okay. Do they laugh? Do they smile? Is he a challenge? Is he a joy? How is he regarded here in the 21st century?
Yeah, so Cicero wrote beautiful Latin, and he's used to teach Latin. So sometimes students have a painful memory, that the first time they're learning their Latin grammar, they have to suffer through all this Cicero. Once they get beyond that point, or when they're reading Cicero in translation, um, and it's going along smoothly, I think people are, my students certainly are very entertained by it. I had a student who actually told me she kept a copy of Cicero's speeches on her bedside table, and in low moments she would flip it open and laugh again at some of her favorite put downs that Cicero delivers. So, I mean, what better testimony could there be than that about his appeal, even to Gen Z or whatever generation we're on right now?
Well, it is 2,000 years later. And the parts that I'm most entertained by, I've only read in English, are when he attacks very prominent women, rich women, for having young lovers. Does that get a laugh from the students to understand that that kind of personality smearing worked then and works now?
Yeah, well, Cicero is not, what we would call politically correct nowadays, I suppose.
No,
So
not
he
even
can,
in the same planet as that. Yes.
yeah, he's an equal opportunity offender. So of course that can shock people sometimes, right? As we said, the courts, were a free for all. The more mud you could sling, the better. So yeah, sometimes people think Cicero is tasteless. Um, very often he went after people who went after him, though, right? And if we just had more, we would probably, I mean, we do have some of the material that Cicero's enemies used against him. So that was the way politics was, right? And it's maybe kind of like some corners of the internet nowadays, for example, where very scurrilous, sensational things spread. Um, it can be potentially damaging, right, to public life to
Right.
to
Right.
conduct things this way. But when you're reading it 2,000 years later, and the stakes aren't quite the same, it often is funny.
Lawless Republic, The Rise of Cicero, The Decline of Rome, Josiah Osgood. This is CBS Eye on the World. I'm John Batchelor.